Have you ever watched a room full of the world's most powerful people fall completely silent? Not out of fear, not out of anger, but because a single voice, soft, calm, unmistakably Filipino, had just said something that pierced through every layer of politics and pride. It happened at the United Nations General Assembly, New York, a cold September morning. Cameras flashing, translators whispering, leaders scrolling through their phones. Business as usual until a name was called. Representative of the Republic of the Philippines. Most didn't look up. Some smiled politely. A few whispered, "Who is he?" And then a young Filipino man stood up, mid-30s, modest suit, no entourage, no prepared PR team behind him, just a folder and a quiet confidence that seemed too steady for someone about to address the world. His name, Miguel Santiago, a former teacher from Iloilo. Not a diplomat, not a politician, not a celebrity, just an ordinary man who somehow found himself standing before the most powerful nations on earth. "What is he doing here?" Someone from the press gallery whispered. Nobody knew yet, but in the next 15 minutes, this Filipino would shake the foundation of that entire hall, not with power, but with truth. Miguel didn't start with statistics or treaties or scripted lines. He started with a story. "When I was 10, he began, my father used to tell me that our country was too small to matter. He said, 'The world doesn't see us, son, so we must work twice as hard and forgive twice as much.' But I think he was wrong." The hall went still. Translators paused. The camera panned closer. Miguel's voice was steady, but his eyes, those unmistakable Filipino eyes, carried the weight of generations who had been overlooked, underestimated, and yet never gave up. He spoke of fishermen rebuilding their boats after typhoons, of nurses who stayed in hospitals during pandemics while the world ran away, of mothers working abroad so their children could dream bigger than they ever did. Then he said something no one in that building expected to hear. "We are not a small nation," he said, his voice rising slightly. "We are a great people disguised as humble servants." There was a long silence from the back. Someone laughed quietly, maybe out of disbelief. But Miguel didn't flinch. He continued, "Maybe you don't see us in your headlines. Maybe we are not seated among the powerful. But when your nations call for help, who answers first? When your soldiers fall, who carries them home? When your people cry for care, who holds their hand?" He looked directly at the Secretary General and then, almost whispering, "When the world forgets what compassion looks like, look to the Filipino." A few people gasped. A few stood still, not knowing how to react. The camera zoomed in. His hand, slightly trembling, held that simple folder. No logos, no national crest, just 3 words written in ink. Humanity first. That was the turning point. The United Nations, a place built on speeches, had just heard one that didn't sound like a speech at all. It sounded like a prayer. But here's the thing, Miguel didn't even plan to speak that day. Originally, the Philippines had sent a senior diplomat, a polished, rehearsed official, but a sudden illness grounded him in Manila. Miguel, who was part of the education mission accompanying the delegation, was asked to fill in temporarily. "Just read the prepared text," they told him. But he didn't, because something in his heart told him the world didn't need another statement. It needed a reminder. A reminder that greatness isn't measured by GDP or military power or how loud you speak. It's measured by the quiet strength of people who serve, love, and rise again, no matter how many times they fall. And that's what made that room, the room of presidents, kings, and billionaires, go silent. There's a saying among diplomats, silence in the UN hall means either disaster or revelation. That day it was revelation. As Miguel stepped down, the chairperson asked him, "Mr. Santiago, that was unexpected. Are you sure that was the official position of your government?" Miguel smiled faintly and replied, "No, sir. It's the position of our people." The interpreter froze. The audience laughed lightly, some admiring, others unsure how to take it. But inside that hall, something shifted. For the first time, they weren't listening to a representative of a country. They were listening to the soul of a people. As Miguel walked back to his seat, a delegate from Finland, an older man with silver hair, reached out his hand and whispered, "Thank you for reminding us why we're here." It wasn't the applause that mattered. It was that small, quiet, almost invisible moment when one man's truth touched something beyond politics. And if you looked closely at the Philippine flag beside his seat, the golden sun on it seemed to shine a little brighter under those lights. That day, the United Nations saw the Philippines not as a country in the margins, but as the conscience of humanity. When Miguel stepped out of the United Nations building, the air in New York felt different. The morning fog had begun to lift, and for a moment he just stood there, a small Filipino man in a crowd of suits and flashing cameras, quietly breathing in the weight of what had just happened. He didn't stay for interviews. He didn't care for headlines. He simply walked down the steps, holding the same folder that carried his handwritten words. Back home, the video of his speech began to spread. At first, just a few shares, then hundreds, then millions. People in schools, offices, jeepneys, and sorry stores began watching. Some cried, some smiled, others whispered, "At last someone said it." In Iloilo, his old students gathered in a classroom, watching their former teacher on a small TV screen. One of them said, "Sir Miguel never raised his voice in class, but when he spoke, everyone listened." The next morning, major international news outlets picked up the story. Filipino educator moves UN to silence. A speech that reminded the world of humanity. The man who spoke from the heart of a nation. When journalists finally tracked him down, Miguel was sitting by the shore, talking to fishermen about rebuilding boats destroyed by the last storm. He wasn't interested in politics. He wasn't planning to run for anything. One reporter asked, "Mr. Santiago, what made you speak the way you did?" He looked out at the sea, quiet for a moment, then said, "Because the world keeps counting nations by power. But I think it's time we count them by kindness." Those words went viral too. Soon, invitations started pouring in, from universities, human rights forums, and even world leaders who wanted him to speak again. But Miguel kept saying no. He wasn't chasing the spotlight. He was chasing something else. Change. He used the small attention his speech brought to raise funds for coastal schools, to supply boats for local fishermen, and to build libraries in far-flung villages where children used to study by candlelight. And yet, what touched people most wasn't the projects, but the humility. He still rode the same tricycle when visiting nearby towns, still ate at the same carinderia, still greeted everyone with the same warm smile. One evening, as the sun dipped into the horizon, his father, the same man who once said their country was too small to matter, sat beside him quietly. "You proved me wrong, son," his father said, voice trembling. "No, Papa," Miguel replied softly. "You just didn't see how big small things can be." The two sat there in silence, watching the waves roll in, 2 generations finally understanding each other through the sound of the sea. Months later, Miguel received a handwritten letter sealed with a blue emblem. It was from the Secretary General of the United Nations. "Dear Mr. Santiago," it read, "your words reminded us of why diplomacy exists. Not for power, but for people. The United Nations will be honored to have you address the General Assembly again next year." Miguel smiled as he folded the letter. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "Maybe it's time the world listens. Not to governments, but to hearts." That night, as lights flickered across his small coastal town, one could almost feel the entire country breathe a little prouder. The teacher who once believed his voice didn't matter had become the echo of a nation.